the objective that I really like for us to be able to present, for me to present to you and for you to kind of get some of this information on from my presentation is that we'll go a little bit on the definition of trauma. What my focus on for today relating to trauma is that, to understand trauma in the context of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and epidemics from that perspective. Like I mentioned, I know that many of you in this audience are expert yourself. So, and my focus today is really from that lens of how can trauma-informed care could be provided through the lens of from the cultural lens, and then that hopefully having this understanding and also the self-assessment of oneself. Once you understand how the cultural aspect impact our own individual way of looking at things, to be able to kind of look at how our services is being delivered for for the audience or the clients that we may be serving. And from that, we'll define the culture and understand the culture through the one particular racial cultural identity development model, which I will go into, and intersectionality. And then from there, we'll look at bias and implicit bias, and I'll talk a little bit about self-assessment and how that tie back to creating that trauma-informed environment that we are all here for. So it's a little bit about me, and then, you kind of see some of these things that I'm going to share a little bit will tie into what I'm talking about when relating to trauma, relating to culture. Who am I? Tôi là ai in Vietnamese. So I am a Vietnamese bilingual and bicultural individual. I came to the United States when I was about 12 years old. So I spoke fluent Vietnamese, I read and write, and now I actually could provide treatment in Vietnamese. And the recognition is that at that age, I did have a sense of self as a young, getting up to a teenager age when I came to America. And then because of the age, I came to America and absorbed the new culture, and it became my identity. So that's one thing I wanted to kind of share and think about this. So on this picture, I wanted to kind of share, you may kind of see a few themes I want to share was my daughter. I have a 5 years old who is half Vietnamese and half Caucasian. I love to scuba dive and travel the world, and photography is another of my passion. I'm passionate about the mental health field, and I have a special interest in my heart because of my lived experience of loss, of suicide. I am passionate about working with children. There's a little picture of one of the kids that drew for me when I used to provide therapy to children at school. You see me wearing in my Vietnamese traditional dress called áo dài, which is Vietnamese traditional dress, and that's what we wear for special occasions. It's basically our national dress. You see a little bit of this. This is actually a South Vietnam flag that, and it's only prior to the Vietnam War that people may be able to recognize what that is. And unless you're Vietnamese, you know what that is. I'm a proud American from that perspective, going back to that adopting that identity as an American. So with that, just a little bit background, professional background. I am currently a program manager for an ACT program with mental health systems. I am a certified trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapist. So, like I mentioned in Dana share, I've been part of the guide team for a long while now and been the chair for the training committee. And it is something that I'm very passionate about. the trauma work, trauma-informed care services, working with children, women, family, suicide prevention type of work, working with severely mentally ill individuals. And I've been working in this field for about 16 years now. So when we talk about trauma, and I'm not going to go into it because most of you probably already, you know, when you've gone through any kind of presentation and you're familiar with trauma, I'm just going to go brief through just the definition. So trauma is the experience of severe psychological distress following any terrible or life-threatening event, according to Psychology Today. And with APA, it's considered to be an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, natural disaster. And SAMHSA, which many of us who are mental health provider, of course, familiar with SAMHSA, they describe the individual trauma as a result of an event, series of events, set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as a physical, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening that have that lasting adverse effect on the individual functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. What I also want to point out is that, you know, trauma doesn't have to be because it happened to you. You could be exposed to trauma and have that lasting life impact. I've worked as a program manager and also provide therapy treatment to children who were exposed to domestic violence, family violence, sexual assault for about 4 years. And I absolutely could tell you from my experience of working with those families, for the children, the exposure is not any less traumatizing or impacting in a negative way to them than if they were to actually have the trauma, specific violence happen to them. So that, like I said, I'll focus more on historical trauma for today. And what historical trauma is considered the multi-generational trauma by a specific culture, racial, or ethnic group. And the primary feature of historical trauma is that the trauma is transferred to subsequent generation through biological, psychological, environmental, social means. And so what it does is it results in a cross-generational cycle of trauma. And often, you know, sometimes we may go, yeah, I could kind of see that, but sometimes it's hard to pinpoint. And sometimes people kind of look at, well, what if I don't think we experienced, my last generation didn't experience certain thing. And I don't know if that's actually is the impact. And, you know, any of those answers, right, because it's really hard to be able to pinpoint that. But sometimes it's about really looking back and understanding the impact for each generation and how that potentially could impact the next generation. So with that, going into the intergenerational trauma, what it is generally refers to the way in which trauma experienced in one generation affects the health and well-being of, you know, the descendants of the future generation. So the picture here that I wanted to share is actually a picture of 2 South Vietnam soldiers carrying their fellow corpse during the Vietnam War. And this picture particularly was shared by my uncle. So he wrote a long post sharing about when he looked at, this was a part of an article by a fellow Vietnamese person who wrote about the experience of the Vietnam War on a Vietnamese newsletter in Melbourne, Australia. I have a large family in Australia. And my uncle, who is the younger brother to my dad, broke in tears and wrote about what that meant for him, what it meant for him when he think about the experience during the war, what it meant for him throughout all these years, and what he sees, what he was seeing in my grandmother. And this, when he wrote this article or post, it was about a year prior to my grandmother's passing. So with the family, you know, we are from Vietnam. We experienced that Vietnam war trauma. My dad is the oldest of 10, and he and his next brother, who were at the age who joined the military during that time, along with my grandfather, his dad. So the three of them were part of the South Republic of Vietnam military, which was against the, you know, Vietnamese communist, the northern region. And so, you know, for those who know, of course, the history of Vietnam War, US military came in to become an ally of the South Republic. Most people know from history is, you know, what you would learn from you know, US history about what happened to the Vietnam War. What most people don't know is the after effect of the war. Also, what that means to these Vietnamese family. The same way how we lost family members, a family member gets separated from each other, and many stories that they don't get reunited. I mean, there's some wonderful stories that we would hear within the Vietnamese community when people get back in touch with each family member after 40 years, you know, things like that. My family, my dad's younger brother is considered deceased, and you know, they never found his body, that they never knew. So the story that my uncle wrote about his older brother, because he was a teenager during this Vietnam War, was that, you know, the trauma that they experienced as a family when they couldn't find their, you know, older brother. And for my dad, that was his next younger brother. And what that means, and all these years that my grandmother used to, there's a saying that the way my uncle would describe it, the way that she would look out to the door, you know, thinking that maybe her son one day just walked through the door, right? So that's one aspect of it. My dad, as a military officer during the war and at the end of the war, by the end of the war, when the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese Communist Party took over, anybody that belonged to the South Republic military essentially get put in prison. What they call was re-educational camp, but it really was prison. And the higher ranking you were, the longer you would stay in prison, essentially. That's how I have then my next brother, who's 5 years younger than me, because he was in prison for 5 years. I was born without my dad being at home because he was in prison. My mother was a 21, 22 years old, you know, young woman, very good woman, take care of her newborn child, being a good daughter-in-law, living with her in-law, taking care of her younger, her husband's younger siblings as well, and being part of the family and take care of the whole family. But see, when I think about that, what that even means, because I honestly don't know what that really means, but it definitely had that impact, right? I grew up for the first 5 years with the story of my dad. You know, there's some wild story as a child I made up as to where my dad was. When people go, "Where's your dad?" And one of the story was, you know, something about, you know, my dad went and sowed banana trees or something. It doesn't make any sense, obviously. But as a child, that's what my family would tell me. Because my dad was in prison in the northern area. Every month, my mom would have to take the train for 2 days, almost 2 days or so, to go visit her husband, leaving her child, me, you know, with my grandmother, with my grandparents and my uncle and aunts. So in that, it always makes me ponder how that impact the next generation, the way it may impact the way I feel, I think, the way it may impact my daughter. Epigenetics. So this is the part where we talk about that in a sense, you know, how does that even impact trauma impact in that sense? What we know is that epigenetic control genes. So whether it's nature or nurture, the genetics, that is what determine our cells, like the specialization, whether how our skin cell, the blood cell, hair cell, like whether like how my daughter is half Caucasian, half Vietnamese, you know, her makeup genetics, the makeup of her dad and myself. Also from nurture, like there's certain environmental stimuli that could also cause genes to turn on and off, right? So when we think about, you know, how do the evolution of certain gene get enhanced more, because that helped us to survive. It's also everywhere. So where we live, where we sleep, where we eat, how we exercise, how we interact with other people, all that can eventually cause the chemical modification around the genes that will turn those genes into whether it's going to get turned on and off over time. And that's exactly what makes us unique. The different combination of what genes get turned on and off is what makes, you know, each and every one of us unique. Not just our skin color, our look, our hair, our makeup of, you know, of physical being, but even who we are. When I went through the training on the cultural piece, and one of the trainer kind of used this example, and I thought it was very powerful, especially, you know, when I think about it as a woman for myself. This is, you know, what you look at is a woman who smokes during while pregnant, that would induce the epigenetic changes in 3 generations at once, right? So the same idea, I have a daughter in herself, in her unborn daughter, and then her unborn daughter's reproductive cells. How powerful is that? So now we shift to when thinking about culture. Just some definition that you know, what we think about culture is it's customary beliefs, it's social norms, material traits of religious, racial, or social group. It could be a set of shared attitudes of values and goals and practices that characterize an institution or organization. So it could be a culture at work. It could just be a set of value or convention of social practice that, you know, associate to a particular field or activity. So, you know, like I don't dive as much anymore, but there's definitely a culture for divers, right? Or I hike, there's a culture for the hikers. The integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, behavior that depends upon the capacity of learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. So it gets passed on, right? It's a certain belief about my Vietnamese culture, because I grew up so close with my parents, with my grandparents. I inherit these beliefs. And sometimes, whether I question it or not, if, as much as I'm one of those strong women, like to question everything and have to believe for myself, through this journey, it's really got me really thinking about, like, how much is that really of me making my own mind at 12 years old too? Part of it is what I absorb and lift, and it through my cells, it through my skin. So we'll get to that part as well too. So when we were examining culture, and I was trying to understand, like, what would be the explanation of how we come up with, some of these culture and how we identify with these culture and that become who we are. There's so many models out there. I mean, there's a model for every group. There's a model for every type of racial or ethnic group, and the subgroups even. But one model that, I thought that to be one of very useful model to explain, especially perhaps it's coming from my own experience, right? Being someone coming from the different cultures and emerging. The racial cultural identity development model, it covers all forms of cultural identity and addresses how one relates to oneself, to others of the same culture, to others of the different culture, and to the dominant cultural group. So when I think of it, like, yeah, you're right, because as a Vietnamese American, I would say I identify with both equally. There's some very strong sense of who I am as a Vietnamese person, and definitely very, very strong sense of who I am as an American. And it also have this distinguished way that I look at, oh, these are the Vietnamese people. How come they like me? How come they not like me? How come I don't agree with them? But there's some aspect, I understand where they may be coming from. The same idea with my relationship with the American culture whom I identify as. And it is also kind of form how I look at, let's say, someone else that are Hispanic, that's someone else who are African American, right? So this model is a 5-stage model that attempts to define the common features that cut across group specific identify development models. And I'm not going to go into it too much when it comes to the specific. It certainly is a very relatable and good model, at least for me, when I identify that. What it does is that the 5 different stages, and one thing I wanted to kind of share is that these stages don't necessarily need to go in a linear fashion. And I certainly found myself throughout my life kind of go between the different stages, questioning, asking, moving. And it could happen pretty much just about myself. It could be happening because of the way I question and view other people that are in my subculture, like the Vietnamese subculture, the American subcultural group, or the other subcultures that I may have friends with, like let's say Hispanic friends, Caucasian friends. But a lot of the main idea about that is this constant variation between going of accepting, depreciating, and appreciating what we make of, what others are make of, and how the combination that might be. Sometimes there's conflict within ourselves. Sometimes there's conflict with the way we think what other group of people are thinking or feeling. Sometimes we agree and we adapt and we take in and appreciate it. And then sometimes we go back and forth. And sometimes we don't even appreciate our own that sense of like who we came from, and maybe we adapt to, the dominant group that everybody is identifying with. So I think the key takeaway from this that I really like about is that variation of it and that acceptance of it, and it's okay that we go through that variation. And so what that leads to is the intersectionality thought about it. The term intersectionality references the critical insight that race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age operate not just unitary, mutually exclusive entities, but as reciprocating constructive phenomena that turn shape complex social inequalities. And the same idea of that's how it shaped us. And then now more and more, we're coming from in a society, a group. And then when I think about the next generation, like my own daughter's generation, many children are no longer make up with one race, make up of one skin tone, make up of one culture anymore, and how that's going to look like for the next generation. And when we look at that, this is a very good kind of map to kind of identify. And for me, it was really about exploring, understanding myself, understanding how that's impacting the way I view others, impacting the way how I view the world. So this is the axis of privilege. And what you see is just a variation of what's considered privileged society normatives and what's the resistance and oppression. And the interesting part when I look at this is it's probably going to look somewhat different for me than, you know, as someone who is considered to be by culture, like truly I identify myself as such just because of the age, the absorbance of culture that I have when I came to the United States, and equally absorbing both the Vietnamese culture and the American culture. But ideally, looking at this to be able to kind of identify for yourself, where you at with what's considered privilege for you? Where you at what's considered to be that, you know, oppression that marginalize, you know, you in this society? So for me, when I look at that, okay, you know, my privilege, I'm heterosexual. That's considered to be the typical, you know, sexual orientation. I'm a cisgender female. I have a higher education. I grew up in a financially stable family, was very supportive of my family. And I have an intact supportive family. I have my parents, I have my brothers, my family here in San Diego. The marginalization, what I think of it as a Vietnamese person, an immigrant coming to the United States, as a female, as a person of color. I could look at it, you know, it doesn't have to be Vietnamese, being an American, but, you know, being a female. English as a second language. And then being that, then, you know, as a first generation in college, when I had to go through some of these, you know, the first one to even figure out how to do this thing in college on my own, and became the first, particularly the first female in my entire family to have a higher education. So when I examine that, it's when I've been kind of go through with some of this journey, learning more about this, it's actually have created some of this insight and question for myself about who I am. And what's have been very enlightening for me is that I've been someone who's proud to say, like, I am the most open-minded person, you know, accepting of the Asian culture, of the American culture. And I used to kind of go, you know, I don't have biases. What are you talking about? I lived in this, you know, social service, mental health world all my life. That's all I wanted to be as a child. And I've lived it. I accept people. But when we really looked at that, go back to the cultural piece, go back to the life that I've lived, and then really examine. When we think about bias, it's a prejudgment toward or against someone or something, right? So it's an in-group or out-group type of reference when we think about that. But when I really look at and we examine implicit bias, and so when we look at bias, you're talking about attitudes, the way we evaluate our preferences for others, prejudice, that those attitude about a certain group or whatnot. Maybe we have certain type of stereotype beliefs about a group, or even having some kind of, prejudice type of behavior and discrimination of sort. So when we talk about implicit bias, it refers to the attitudes or the stereotype that affects our understanding, action, or decision in an unconscious manner. So then see right there, that's the part where I am able to kind of go, well, you don't know what you don't know. If you're not even realizing that you're biased, how would you know that you're not biased? So you got to dig deep. And that's what it's been a little bit of that journey for me to even figure that out for myself. And hence there was that need for that self-assessment, constant self-assessment. And I think even as a clinician, as a therapist, I mean, in grad school, that's what, we spend a whole section, we spend plenty of time, and they make us even go through therapy ourselves so that we could go through that self-assessment to really learn. But even with that, it's really hard to admit for ourselves and go, wait a minute, I might have that bias without even me knowing. So I remember when I went through this test for the very first time. So this would be a website that I would encourage if you are interested in going and find the test, to take the test for yourself, the project implicit test. So one of the tests I took, and it actually told me that I have a preference for light-skinned people. I go, no, that can't be. I mean, I had friends with everybody. My whole family makeup is a very diverse family, actually. I have a Vietnamese sister-in-law. I have a Hispanic sister-in-law. I have a, Chinese, soon-to-be sister-in-law. One of my brothers is gay. And so I'm like, there's no way. But then I go in my mind, wait a minute. At some point, I remember culturally in the Vietnamese culture, there's certain aspect of discrimination, there's certain aspect of preference. So let's say during the Vietnam War, go back to that, the American soldiers were there. And generally speaking, any of those children products of these love story or interactions between the American soldiers and the women during the Vietnam War. First of all, they weren't looked at kindly because of the cultural aspect of it. But the other part is that the half-Black kids that were produced during that time were not preferred. I mean, although they didn't like those aspect because they had the cultural aspect of what it means for these women to be impregnated or have children with these American soldiers, marrying outside their culture. But the half-white kids were looked at as a better option, or better kids than the half-Black one. I remember my mom as a young, I moved down to California. I, of course, start tanning as a young adult. My mother was not very pleased with me when I come home that I was all dark, because I'm actually technically very kind of considered to be light-skinned for Vietnamese. And in the Vietnamese culture, light skin is preferred. And that come back to, the long history of what that means to the Vietnamese culture. And I get yelled at, like, why do you all go get dark for? You don't look good being dark. So it's interesting, and it's eye-opening, and it's a lot to learn from that. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the idea is that in order for us to really provide trauma-informed services, are we recognizing the impact of the violence, the victimization of the history that we experience and how we could kind of then translate it in the way that we could help a person cope with it. Do we establish the recovery from the trauma as a primary goal? Do we put that in recognition that this is what a person may have experienced and how that impacts them? Do we employ the empowerment model to kind of know that you could move beyond and move past that and learn from it? To maximize the choice and control over what the person is willing to say and do. Like my choice to share some of these personal history and experience from my own personal experience as well as my whole family. But on that, then it becomes this relational collaboration in the treatment that we could do and provide. It's the environment that we design to ensure that safety and respect and acceptance when we are able to meet with those who come to us for support. How can we highlight the strengths and the resiliency and minimize the possibility of re-traumatization? And then culturally, being competent to understand the clients, the people that we serve in the context of their life experience. I have my life experience, and not just from my life, this life. It came from my parents' life. It came from my grandparents' life, and it became part of my life experience. And how can we get that input and feedback in the design and evaluation of the services that we provide to our community, to the clients that we serve, to the people that we work with. So thank you. I have my contact information, both my work email and also the training committee email if you would like to get in touch with me. And by the way, I welcome if anybody would like to very much join the training committee. Thank you.